Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today, and I'm so glad you found this podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to build a world with better bosses, and we do that by introducing you to the greatest minds working in the leadership space. Our goal is to provide you with practical information to help you along your leadership path, whether you're new to leadership or a seasoned pro. So, thank you for listening in. It's an honor to be your host and leadership guide in this journey. Today's episode is brought to you by the Salty Sailor Coffee Company, Cadre of Men, and Pharaoh Skincare. You can find the links to all of our sponsors and all of my books in the show notes. Today, we're talking about what it takes to quickly become a leader that everybody wants to follow. And my guest is Don Frericks. Don is an insightful leadership development expert and author of the amazing new book called Best Boss Ever. Now, if you're wondering what it takes to become an extraordinary leader, listen into this incredible conversation with Don. Are you ready to dive in? Let's get started. Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Don Frericks. Don is a seasoned leadership development expert with over 25 years of experience transforming managers into extraordinary leaders. He is an inspirational executive coach, leadership team developer, facilitator, and executive advisor. Don is the author of Best Boss Ever, Rapidly Develop Yourself into the Leader Everybody Wants to Follow. And in this book, Don explores the critical role that leadership plays in shaping workplace culture, employee engagement, and organizational success. I'm excited to have him on the show to talk about how to become the best boss ever. So, Don, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you having me.
Oh, it's great to meet you. And as I mentioned before we press record, I had to have you on the show when you wrote the book, Best Boss Ever. And we're trying to build a world with better bosses here on this podcast. I mean, we had to have you on the show to meet you and hear your story. So, welcome.
Thank you. I love the purpose that your podcast has. And I believe with all of my heart, and I bet you do too, and I'd love to hear about this, that, we're not just playing around with an idea that's just somewhat important to either one of us, but that this is so important for the future of society that, if you look at every aspect of our world today, whether it's economics or geopolitical or what's happening with our economies as well as what's happening with our earth. And there's just so many needs for greater leadership because the problems have never been more complex. And living on a planet with 8 billion people is super complex. So we need the very best leaders we can possibly find. And I assume that's why you started the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reason I do what I do is because I think the level of employee engagement has consistently been low throughout the U.S. and the world. And I think a lot of that has to do with our with leaders and leadership. And so for me, it's I want people to have a positive experience at work. And I think that our jobs as leaders to create that environment where people actually enjoy what they do, enjoy going to work. And I hear so many stories of bad bosses that I want to try to make a difference. So yeah, I think they're both reasons are the right reasons to try to get people to become better at leadership.
I literally started executive coaching in the leadership domain with executives because I had the same experience. I had three situations where I was hired by someone that said, "Hey, come in and help me transform this part of the organization." They were a great boss. They were fantastic, inspirational. They got the best out of me. I really enjoyed working for them. And within 6 to 9 months, they left the organization. And then the next person came in and said, "Who are you? And why are you here?" In other words, I don't have anything to do with that agenda. I'm not going to fund that change program. I don't even like it. I don't like you. And Attila the Hun walked into my life. And it happened to me. And I just noticed how dramatic it affected me personally, and then my wife and my children and my family and all of my coworkers. And you're 100% right. The disengagement that's created by bad leadership is enormous. And it's such a productivity drain on our companies in the United States and around the world, even worse around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that we owe it to our employees, the people that you know that put their faith in us and come to our companies, come to our organizations to make the best out of what we can. We were talking about that today. I teach a college class, and we were talking about is it results or is it people? And I said it's both. And I think that's our job, is that we have to get create the best environment and get the best results in our organization. If we do that, then the people above us say, "Oh, they've got the results, which is great. And the people below us say, hey, they take care of us and they're great. So I think a great leader gets results and takes care of the people at the same time. And I think that's what we're looking to try to do is get more of that in this
Yes.
world. Yeah,
Well
yeah,
said. I agree
yeah.
100%.
Yeah, so let's get started. I asked this a lot to our guests, and so I'm interested to see what you have to say. Do you think leaders are made or are they born?
Right. Thank you. Easy softball question. The evidence would point to that they're made, and that's why you do and what I do, the work that we do, and we see it each and every day. I can't tell you how much joy I get out of giving someone a leadership 360 at the beginning of a coaching engagement and at the end of the coaching engagement to see how much progress they've made. And I was just writing in a blog post today about an individual who went from one very big strength to 14 very big strengths in just a little over a year. And it's amazing when you see that happen. So we know the evidence is that people can develop their leadership ability. But I think we should try to answer this question, John. Why is that important? Why is that important to your listeners? I think the answer, and I'm curious about yours too, is because if leaders can be made, then we've got to ask ourselves, what am I doing about that? If I'm in a
Mm,
leadership role, right? Have I taken that responsibility on, or am I waiting for my manager or my organization to do something for me? And it's fascinating to me how many times I talk to people about that, and they'll say, well, they don't really do any leadership development here at this company. And I've asked before and I've been told no. And therefore, I'm really not doing anything. I might read a book occasionally, but I don't have one I'm reading right now. And occasionally I'll listen to a podcast. They're really not into any meaningful development as a leader. And I shake my head like, I don't understand that. I don't get that because there seems to be a responsibility to be a leader. And if you know that you can develop your skills, why aren't you working on that each and every day of your work life?
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think you're right. I think leaders can be made, and I think you make it through. I think two things. One is education, and one is experience. And two is experience, right? So to be a great leader, you have to practice leadership, and I think that's part of it. But I think you touched on something that's really important: is self development. What are you doing to continue to push yourself to learn? One of the things I've said often is that leadership is a little bit like learning chess. You can figure it out very quickly, the basic moves and what have you, but it takes a lifetime to master. And the longer I've been in the leadership field, the more I realize I don't know. And I think there's a never ending, there's, you can constantly learn more about how to become a better leader, how to be more effective leader. There's so much that I still have yet to learn. So the fact that for anyone that says they've arrived and they're the best leader they can be and they're never going to get any better, I would argue that I've got 30 years that says you probably can get better.
No doubt. I asked a group of extraordinary leaders this same question that if you'd like me to say a little bit more, and I was
Yeah.
fascinated. There's about 22 of them, and I asked the same question, and they all agreed with what we're saying. But one person, the person that actually had the biggest job, he at one point became the CEO and then chairman of U.S. Bancorp, and he was a personal friend of mine. And after he received the CEO-ship, I called him and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And we talked and chatted a little bit as friends with that. And I said, just wondering, how many direct reports do you have now? And he said, well, there's 73,000 people that work for the company. And I just said, are you kidding me? The guy that I used to have pizza with down in Cincinnati is now in Minneapolis with 73,000 people working for him. Anyway, I said to Richard, I said, hey, do you think that an extraordinary leader is made or born? I changed the question just a little bit, put the emphasis on extraordinary. He said, Don, I believe extraordinary leaders are born. I said, really? That's
Mm,
so different. I said, say more. He said, well, they're very rare. And second of all, he said, I think what I see in natural born leaders, and I believe that there are those, that they have an easier time learning leadership
yeah.
than the rest of us. And I thought,
Yeah.
oh, I see what you mean. They still have to learn, but they have a faster start. They have more skill to start with. Maybe they're extroverted and people oriented from the get-go in their life. But for those of us that are more introverted, we have to work a little bit harder at it because
Yeah.
natural, right?
That's a great point. I think you're right. There's some people do have a head start in this, but it doesn't mean that you can't learn. I have a friend that mentioned that he was an introvert, and I said, "Well, I'm a recovering introvert. You know, like I was an introvert for my early days, but as you know, as running when you run businesses, and I'm doing an all employee meeting every month for 30 years, I get pretty much, and I'm on the shop floor all the time. I'm pretty much an extrovert now, and I don't know when it happened when I made the switch, but now I love people. I love being around people, and so yeah. But I think you're right. Some people have the head start, and they are naturally, like being around people, and so it sort of took me a while to develop those skills. I think.
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. Um, yeah, so I think you touched on some of it, like, we see that, again, some leaders are better than others. We see some that are extremely good. What would you say some of the what does it take to really be an extraordinary leader? What does it take to really be one of the best leaders, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think there's so many answers to that question, and there are so many books. I'm sure if I could see your bookshelf, you're like myself, where you've got what 50 books on your bookshelf proclaiming what they know about leadership and what the key aspects are, and they're all excellent, and they all have great wisdom points, and reading all of them is exciting, and then sometimes confusing because there's so many different ideas about what it takes to be a great leader. I found a company. Are you aware of the company called Zenger Folkman? Out of Utah, Zenger Folkman.
Yeah, I've heard of them. Yeah, yeah.
And they spent 2 years researching this question. So they got my attention right away because I said, whoa, wait a minute. Here's somebody that doesn't just have a theory about what it takes to be a great leader. Here's somebody that does the analysis and has a scientific approach to really looking at it. They looked at over 44 different leadership 360 assessments. And they asked the question, out of all these factors that we're looking at, which ones really differentiate from poor leadership, from good leadership to extraordinary leadership? And they only found 19 differentiating competencies that point to statistically what makes a good leader better than a poor leader and what makes an extraordinary leader better than a good leader. And so I love to think about those 19 competencies. And that's why I'm very much driven towards allowing my clients to start with a 360 and then end the engagement with the 360 because it measures those 19 differentiating items that really does make a great leader. The good news about their research, though, John, is that they found that it only takes 3 to 5 of those things to be considered extraordinary. Like if you're really, really good at the top 10% in the world, of those 19, 3 to 5 of those 19 things, you will be perceived as an extraordinary leader. And your 3 to 5 can be completely different than mine and vice versa. But effectiveness of an extraordinary leader is often twice as great as a good leader. And I
Mm.
think part of the plague that we have in leadership development today is we develop people to the good level, but we don't push them to extraordinary. And we know that a lot of extraordinary leaders, and just based statistically on the research they've done, can actually impact profitability to about twice the amount of a good leader. And so, from a profitability standpoint, a sales standpoint, a customer service standpoint, extraordinary leaders have a dramatic effect on an organization. But we don't really push our people to be extraordinary. We're good with good enough. And I would say if good is good enough, your business has a problem because you're not getting people to push and go the extra mile to become extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what, we in business, right? We're always looking for that extra edge, right? We're always looking for how can we get more with less, right? How can we get the best out of our team? So you would think that pushing people to that extraordinary level of leadership would be a good ROI, right? So we believe in ROI in business, right? So it would seem that would be great. And if you've I was thinking about Jim Collins' work, and he wrote about level 5 leadership of these leaders that took their companies from good to exceptional to great, right? To beat market averages like over decades, right? And so these are extraordinary leaders, right? These level 5 leaders. When I first read about that in Good to Great from with Jim Collins, is I thought, well, soon everyone's going to learn how to be a level 5 leader because look at the results. But yet it was almost ignored. It was almost like, oh, these are rare birds. They don't, you can see them every once in a while, but we're not going to be working on a plan to develop level 5 leaders. But, it's almost like and even Jim Collins himself said, these are rare things. They rarely reach CEO levels because of their humility, because they tend to be a little more humble, and they're not, braggadocious, and they're not all about themselves. Right. And so these humble but fierce leaders, I thought everybody would be trying to teach how to be a humble and fierce leader because of the success, but yet it hasn't really caught on in terms of leadership development. I rarely hear much about level 5 leadership.
It's a tremendous point. I appreciate you bringing it up. That book was written over 20 years ago, and for your listeners that have not picked up the book, Good to Great, I highly recommend it for all the reasons you just talked about. It was the first time that I've ever seen the word humility used as a descriptor of a great leader, an extraordinary leader, and I think there's a reason for that, right? He was very clear that the research team that he had, were kind of mystified by this funny combination of this personal resolve to drive results and for the business to be successful. But they were so humble, like they didn't have big, huge egos like so many of the business people are used to seeing on social media. So to me, I think it's a wonderful paradox to explore. If you're interested in becoming a great leader, how do I grow my skills to an extraordinary level and yet hold on to humility so that I don't allow my ego to get in the way of connecting with people?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it brings up a question, and I think about this a lot is, the things that make you an effective leader from your follower standpoint, right, may not make you an effective leader from the people that might try to promote you. So, and I think to Jim Collins' point was saying that, these humble but fierce people rarely get into these senior executive roles because the boards are looking to fill it with a caricature of the CEO, the good looking, charismatic, well spoken, and it's all about me, and so that's the people that they hire. They don't hire the quiet, the humble, and the ones that are just dedicated to making their business better. So it's interesting that we so sometimes we often don't promote the best leaders, right? They end up somewhere in an organization, and they don't fit the mold we think that what a good leader should look like.
It's such a great point. I'm sure you've seen it in, your 30 years in manufacturing where maybe the wrong person was promoted for the wrong reasons. And I think that's a cultural issue where a cancer starts to develop because if that
Mm.
happens once and then happens twice and word gets out that, you need to do a certain thing or be a certain way or look a certain way to get promoted, it just takes the air out of everyone's sails and you lose that engagement that you're talking about earlier. You don't want to work hard. You don't want to go the extra mile in an organization where you see that there's a lack of integrity in the way that they handle the promotion process. And if they're doing it in the promotion process, it probably shows up in other ways as well. I was working in a business. I was a chief administrative officer, smallish company, about 350 employees at the time. And I had human resources reporting into me. And I was being told that the chief operating officer was going around me to the CEO to get bonuses for herself and her team. And I'm like, what? What's up with that? And the CEO never told me what was going on. He allowed it. And it's like, no, this is a foul. We have to call timeout on this. This is an egregious foul because it should be run through me. You just can't go ahead and have a bonus made just because you want to have a bonus made. And there's got to be some rules to it. And just because you're trying to take care of a person, we have to follow our process and we have to be consistent with the processes we put into place to be respectful and to take care of all of our employees, not just the one or two key people. So it was interesting how bad behavior, I think, breeds bad behavior. And that's what you
Yeah.
often see from bad leaders.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. If you and again, we set the standard by what we allow, right? And so if we allow the bad behavior to continue or to even exist, and we don't do something about it, then it's like, oh, okay, well, that's the standard. That's what's acceptable behavior. And I think that's, sometimes leaders say, well, I don't want to address that person because I don't like conflict. It's going to be difficult. But yeah, when you don't, you're saying that whatever that behavior is acceptable and it's allowed. And so now people who are following the rules say, well, wait, why am I following the rules when other people aren't? right? So
Yes,
and yeah, so it's not good. So it's contagious. So it's so if especially I talk a lot about culture, and if you are really I think a leader's job is to establish and maintain the culture, and when you allow actions that are not consistent with your values to continue, then you affect the culture. You one little thing changes in the culture, and then suddenly something is accepted that wasn't never accepted before, and it's you have to be careful about that because it's a slippery slope that can really hurt the culture over time if you continue to allow behaviors that are not consistent with your values.
I agree. I would assume in the Navy, and I've never served in the military, but assume in the Navy you wouldn't have this happen as often as it happens in business, or is that incorrect?
Well, I think each ship, I think the captain has an intent, and so that we talk about the captain has like his standing orders and his night
Mm.
orders, and those are sort of like his expectations, and so that's sort of his. These are the rules of the game, and each captain establishes those on his ship. So, yeah, I think it can happen on a ship too, where if somebody does violate those standing orders and nothing is done about it, then other people hear that and say, okay, well maybe that's acceptable that we could do that. So no, I think it's the same thing in the military too. I think that if you establish standards, you have to maintain those standards, and I think that when you don't, then everybody's standards then lower, throughout the whole organization. So I think it's important that even the military was that these are the standards, these are what we expect. I even for my company, I have what I call my expectations, and so it's a list of things that I give to every new employee, and it's in the break room and all that. But it's like, here are the 13 things that I expect from my employees, and it's like, and those are, and if there's a violation of those, I will say something about it with my employees. So these are important to me. So number one is we treat each other with respect, and so if I see disrespect, I'm going to address it right away because it's the number one issue in my company.
That's perfect. I love that because that's what leaders do. They set the standards and then they hold people accountable to those standards. And I appreciate you sharing that because I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a lot of listeners on here. Some are new to leadership, and so they're just either getting their first promotion or, they maybe now they're a team leader where there was a production employee in the past, and so now they're starting in that path of leadership. Um, if they want to become an extraordinary leader, if they want to become the best boss ever, where do they start? Where do you start in this journey? As we talk about, it's a vast ocean of information, but where do you get started?
So many places to start, John, as you know. And I think it's confusing to a lot of new leaders because it looks like there's more information you can possibly wrap your arms around to be able to digest. I think the best place to start, though, is getting feedback. It just feels right to me that if you're going to start this journey of transformation and you're going to become something that you're not today, you've got to figure out how people perceive you. And I love Leadership 360s, but there's other ways to get feedback too. You can solicit it yourself. You can have someone do interviews on your behalf. You can use surveys. There's a lot of different tools, but I find that most of us are starved for feedback. We just haven't been in an environment where that feedback naturally flows to us. And I think today's younger employees are really looking for critical feedback based on what I read. They're not just looking for feedback in general. Hey, you're doing great. Keep doing what you're doing. That's not useful. They want to hear, hey, what do I need to improve? How do I get better? And as a young leader trying to become an extraordinary leader, we have to seek that kind of feedback. And often there are many, many things to be learned early on. I think for me, and I'm curious about what you would say, John, the hardest jobs in leadership are those at the entry level, the supervisors, especially like the third shift supervisor in a manufacturing plant, right? That's a hard job because those people that you're supervising may not be the world's best employees just because they have to get on third shift sometimes. They can be wonderful, don't get me wrong, but they can also be super challenging. There's a lot of management that's involved with that leadership job for that supervisor. So How do you get feedback? Well, I think that's something you need to really challenge your manager and the organization to provide to you. And if you can't get it through them, you've got to go get it yourself. You have to ask people for specific feedback. There are plenty of tools on the internet that you can find to, in terms of what questions should I ask to get that kind of feedback. So that's not the problem. It's just probably finding the time, making the time, and then finding the courage to ask for very specific feedback from people.
Yeah, I like that. We had a past guest that said something I really liked. She said, "Ask your for as simple as thing is just say, give me three adjectives that describe me." And then you write down the three adjectives that you would like to be known as a leader, and then you sort of
Yes.
ask different people to give you just three adjectives, and then you do a little comparison, like, I want to be this, and what am I hearing from the feedback? Just those three adjectives, and I thought it was a really simple and easy way, without any tools or anything, just to get that initial feedback. And it's like, okay, because I think, I tell the story in past episodes where I had an employee say to me, we love working for you. We always feel challenged. Uh, but here's the problem, John. And I was like, okay, here it comes. It's like, you never take a rest. So we get to a new level of performance, and as we're all trying to catch our breath, you're off racing to the next objective, right? And so, and he said, you never celebrate the wins, and you're always saying that's great, but we could be better. And so we like being that you are pushing us to a higher level, but you don't give the time to celebrate. You don't. And I learned that as a leader, you can't be too far out in front. And I was way too far out in front, and my people they couldn't keep up with me because I was just running. I was excited. I was young, and I was, gunning for, we could do better. We could do better. And I think that was a valuable lesson getting that feedback, is like, if you want to be a great leader, you have to turn around to see if you have followers, right? And I didn't have any followers because they couldn't keep up. And I think that's something, it was good feedback early on, to get that feedback. But you need to have people that are going to be honest with you and confide in you.
It's a good point. And the reason that you and I are talking about feedback for your listeners is that you could generically go out and say, I'm just going to read about great leaders and pick up a generic tip or trick about leadership and practice that. You could. I mean, that's not a bad place to start, but it's not as good as feedback. And the reason why is that to your point, your story, it was about something that was very specific to you that you was in the way of you being a better leader for your team, for your people. And that's where I think leadership lives. It lives at the point of contact between leaders and followers. So if those adjustments we make in our leadership are much more powerful than generic tips and tricks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So how can, one of the things that's important in leadership is authenticity. So how can leaders find their own authentic leadership style?
Gosh, I think there's a lot of ways. There are different profiles today, as you're, I'm sure, well aware of. There's different profiles like DISC and social style and Enneagram and Myers-Briggs and so many wonderful assessments that are out there to kind of learn about your style. I kind of prefer the social style model because it's a behavioral model. And one way to start to understand yourself as well as others is to use a model like that. That's a four-box model. With social style, we talk about different styles like amiable, analytical, expressive, and driver. And the drivers and the amiables don't get along so well because they're opposite styles. And so if you're one of those two styles, you need to know what your preferences are, but you need to know what the other style's preferences are. And what we know about great leaders is they aren't any one of those four styles because there's strengths and weaknesses to each one of those styles. But the best leaders are the ones that have versatility or the ability to adapt their style to work with another style, one of the other three that are there. Only about 25% of the world are going to be in each one of those four boxes. So, if you're going to just act and behave as if everyone should act and behave like you do, you're going to be 75% of the time wrong and ineffective. So, learning your style and what the pluses and minuses are to it allows you then to temporarily adapt to other people's styles so that you can be more like them. And that's what really good leaders do. They stretch their comfort zone in a way that allows them to connect more deeply with other styles and other styles' preferences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and I think you're right. I think we have to. It takes a while to find your authentic voice in anything that you do. When you start, you might, for example, when you start being a leader, you might be acting like maybe your favorite leader in the beginning. So you're pretending to be what you think is a great leader, but eventually you find your own voice. One of the things you said is really important is that I think leadership is it's important to be adaptable, right? And I think there isn't no one size fits all to how people are motivated. So I think one of the advantages I had as a submariner is I learned early on in my leadership career that I spent a lot of time with my sailors. Like we spent 6 hours, on watch together. I learned everything about them. They knew everything about me. So that made it easy for me to know what motivated them, what got them out of bed every morning, what excited them. And so I think it helped me to adapt my leadership style to best fit their needs, right? And I think that I often say that you can't lead people you don't know. I think the more you know your people, the more that you can figure out, okay, this guy, he needs a kick in the pants every once in a while. That's just his style. This one here, we never yell at him, right? It's always he focuses. He does better with positive reinforcement. So I think part of it is getting to know your people and to see what they need, what works best with them, and how they react to feedback.
You're 100%. Leadership is a relationship business, so there's no
Yeah.
doubt. And the best relationships are built on trust and respect. You mentioned that earlier. And so, as leaders, we have to do everything we can to build that trust and respect so that they will allow us to have true, authentic relationships.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion. I want to mention too the book is called Best Boss Ever, and I want to talk about that. Or I just want to make sure I highlight that because again, the purpose of this podcast is to build a world with better bosses. I love the fact that you've written a book about how to become the best boss ever. But what final message, Don, would you like to leave with our listeners today?
Yeah, I think, John, I think you and I both are trying to stand up in the world saying it's possible. You can be a
Mm.
better leader. You can be the best leader you want to be. And to be extraordinary will make an extraordinary difference on the world. And we hope that you'll join us in doing that. And certainly use the resources that we both make available on our websites to do that. And we'd be glad to try to help you and assist you to if there's any assistance that's needed.
Absolutely. Well, such a great message. How can our listeners find out more about you, the work you do, and this book?
Yeah, I'm active on LinkedIn and lots of posts and newsletters that go out there, and also on my website, which is at donfrericks.com.
All right, very good. We're going to put links to the show notes to all of Don's resources. Now, if there's something in this discussion that you've sort of said, okay, wait, I need to unpack that a little bit more, or you got questions for Don, please reach out. We've got his links here, his website, his LinkedIn profile. Reach out to him, ask questions. That's why we bring experts on the show so that you can be informed, but also you have now a contact that you can reach out to and ask questions. So if you're saying, hey, I get it. I want to be an extraordinary leader, but I'm struggling with how to get started. Or maybe Don mentioned one of these different methods for evaluating your leadership, your authentic leadership voice. Well, where do I find it? How do I get it? Well, reach out to Don. He's going to tell you how to do that. So, Don, I want to thank you for coming on the show. Thanks for sharing your experience, your knowledge. I think that we learned a lot through this conversation.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you again. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.